Every film tells two stories, the one you watch and the one that unfolds quietly behind the scenes.
When stories like this break, they usually arrive fully formed, with reactions already circulating and conclusions that feel settled almost immediately. But that version of events is rarely where the story actually begins. In the Blake Lively case, most attention landed on what became visible later: messages, unfollows, statements, and headlines that appeared once everything was already in motion. What's been harder to see is how the situation took shape before any of that reached the public. Part of the reason this case drew so much attention is because Taylor Swift's name eventually became connected to it, not through a headline or a public comment, but through proximity at a stage when decisions were still being shaped quietly and out of view. Because when you slow the story down, it isn't just about what was said, or even who said it. It's about timing, who was involved early, who had access as choices were being made, and how those early conditions narrowed what was possible later on. There's one underlying question that connects all of it: how the timeline, the control behind the scenes, and the evidence that surfaced afterward fit together, and whether the outcome was already taking shape long before most people realized there was a story at all. This video isn't about assigning blame or revisiting online reactions. It's about putting the events back in order, understanding how private decisions and shifting influence came first, and why the public version of the story only makes sense once you look at what happened earlier. When most people first became aware of the Blake Lively case, it didn't arrive gradually. It appeared as a finished story, with headlines already in circulation, reactions already forming, and opinions moving faster than explanations. For many viewers, the case seemed to begin at the moment it became visible. Attention quickly settled on a handful of public moments: messages that surfaced, unfollows that were noticed, and statements that appeared once interest had already gathered. Those details became the reference points people used to understand what was happening. They were treated as the starting line, even though they weren't. From the outside, the situation looked sudden. One phase appeared to end, another began, and the shift felt abrupt. Online discussions framed it as a reaction, something that escalated because of what had just happened. That framing made the case feel emotional and immediate, driven by visible conflict rather than longer buildup. As a result, early conversation focused on surface-level questions: who responded first, who didn't respond at all, what certain gestures might have signaled. Individual moments were isolated and examined closely, often without much attention to what came before them. At that stage, most people didn't associate the situation with Taylor Swift at all. Her connection hadn't surfaced publicly, and it didn't appear to factor into the visible narrative people were reacting to. The story, as it was understood then, felt contained within a narrow set of events and personalities. That way of looking at the case was understandable. Public information usually works that way. People respond to what they can see, and what they can see often arrives late in the process. By the time messages or statements become public, decisions have already been made. But this approach also created gaps. Important details didn't seem to line up. Timelines felt unclear. Some reactions appeared disproportionate, while others felt relayed or restrained. For viewers trying to make sense of it in real time, the story didn't always add up. That confusion wasn't because the information was wrong, it was because the public version of the case didn't start at the beginning. It started somewhere in the middle, after key choices had already narrowed the range of possible outcomes. Before the Blake Lively case entered public view, activity around it had already begun. Decisions were being made quietly, conversations were taking place, and positions were forming without any outside attention. None of it looked dramatic at the time, which is part of why it went largely unnoticed. Early stages like this rarely announce themselves. There are no headlines or reactions to point to, only small signals: who is included in discussions, who isn't, and which conversations happen privately rather than publicly. These moments don't feel decisive when they occur, but they often determine what options remain later. At this point, access mattered more than statements. Being present early meant having influence over direction before anything became fixed. Once a situation reached public awareness, many of those elements were already set. What the public eventually saw were outcomes, not the groundwork that led there. This early phase is also when Taylor Swift was already close enough to the situation to be part of the environment where decisions were forming, even though nothing about that proximity was visible publicly at the time. Her presence didn't create attention then, but it mattered because it coincided with a period when direction was still flexible. Looking back, it becomes clear that several developments occurred well before public attention arrived. They didn't trigger reactions at the time because there was nothing visible to react to. To anyone outside the process, everything still appeared normal. That gap between private activity and public awareness helps explain why later moments felt sudden or confusing. From the outside, it looked like things shifted quickly. From the inside, the direction had already been set. This doesn't point to a single turning point, it suggests a buildup, one that unfolded quietly through timing, access, and early alignment. By the time the story reached wider attention, many of the choices that shaped it had already been made. Understanding what was happening before anyone noticed doesn't rewrite the story, it simply places it back in order. And once that order becomes clearer, the rest of the case starts to make more sense. As the Blake Lively case moved closer to public attention, focus eventually turned to specific messages and interactions. These moments became central to how the story was discussed, not because they started everything, but because they offered a visible reference point once people were already paying attention. Messages tend to draw focus because they feel concrete. They have timestamps, wording, and recipients that can be examined closely. When parts of these conversations surfaced, they were treated as turning points, evidence of something changing. In reality, they reflected where things already stood. What gave these messages their weight wasn't just what was written, but when they appeared in the timeline. Some conversations took place while options were still open. Others happened later, after direction had largely settled. That difference matters because timing changes how messages function. Some of the exchanges people later focused on involved Taylor Swift directly, which is why their placement in the timeline mattered more than the wording itself. Messages sent during an early, flexible stage carried a different meaning than those sent once boundaries were already forming. Public discussion often blurred these distinctions. Conversations from different points in time were grouped together and treated as a single moment of escalation. That made it easier to argue about intent, but harder to understand process. There were also moments that didn't involve messages at all. Short interactions, decisions not to respond, or shifts in tone that only became clear later. These moments didn't produce screenshots or quotes, but they still contributed to the direction the situation was taking. When viewed together, the messages and moments don't suggest a sudden change. They point to a gradual narrowing of possibilities. By the time certain exchanges became visible, they weren't opening new paths. They were confirming the direction the situation was already moving in. This is why focusing on individual messages can be misleading. They didn't change the course on their own. They signaled that the course had already been set, quietly, over time, and mostly out of public view. Once messages and interactions began circulating publicly, it was easy to treat them as the cause of everything that followed. But when the timeline is examined more carefully, timing becomes more important than content. The same words can carry very different meaning depending on when they're sent and what has already taken place. In this case, some messages appeared after key decisions were effectively locked in. By that point, options had narrowed, Positions had formed, and the room for adjustment was limited. Messages sent at that stage weren't steering the situation, they were responding to it. Earlier moments mattered for a different reason. Conversations that happened while direction was still flexible carried more weight, even if they seemed ordinary at the time. That's when access translated into influence. Not because anyone was trying to shape an outcome overtly, but because early input tends to frame how later developments are understood. When Taylor Swift's name eventually entered public discussion, it did so after several of these early moments had already passed. That's why visibility alone doesn't explain her role. What matters more is proximity during the earlier phase, before the story reached public awareness and before narratives began to settle. Public discussion tends to compress timelines. Events that unfolded over an extended period get grouped together, creating the impression of a sudden shift. That compression makes it harder to see which moments actually carried weight and which ones simply reflected what had already been decided. This also helps explain why some reactions felt delayed or restrained. They weren't responses to a single trigger, but to an accumulation of earlier choices that had already shaped the path forward. Without that context, later actions can seem confusing or out of proportion. Seeing the case through the lens of timing doesn't assign blame or change facts. It restores order. It shows that the turning point wasn't a single message or interaction, but the moment when enough prior decisions had gathered to make alternative outcomes unlikely. Once that buildup is acknowledged, the story becomes less about isolated exchanges and more about how early conditions quietly set the boundaries for everything that followed. As the Blake Lively case continued to develop, one of the least visible changes was how control shifted quietly, without any public signal. There was no announcement and no clear moment that marked a change in direction. Influence moved gradually, through access and positioning, rather than through statements or formal decisions. In situations like this, control doesn't usually change hands all at once. It shifts through everyday processes: who is consulted early, whose input is sought repeatedly, and which perspectives begin to guide decisions before anything becomes public. These shifts rarely attract attention, but they shape outcomes long before reactions appear. In this case, the change wasn't obvious from the outside. Conversations continued, work moved forward, and nothing seemed out of place publicly. Internally, however, the balance of influence was settling. Certain viewpoints carried more weight, while others had less room to shape direction. This period also overlaps with private text conversations that later became part of public discussion. During that time, Taylor Swift was close enough to the situation to be present while decisions, edits, and positioning were still being discussed. That proximity didn't generate headlines then, but it mattered because it coincided with a moment when outcomes were still flexible. Once control begins to shift this way, later developments tend to follow a predictable pattern. Decisions feel settled before the public becomes aware they were ever open for discussion. By the time attention arrives, the groundwork has already been laid. This helps explain why some later responses appeared measured or indirect. When influence has already moved, public actions often reflect that reality rather than challenge it. Silence, timing, and alignment can communicate more than overt statements at that stage. Understanding how control shifted, quietly and without spectacle, doesn't change what happened next. It explains why what followed unfolded the way it did, and it reinforces a broader point of this case, that the most consequential moments weren't the loudest ones, but the earliest and least visible. Once the Blake Lively case entered public view, the story began to behave differently. Attention shifted outward, interpretations multiplied, and the space for quiet adjustment narrowed almost immediately. What had been flexible behind the scenes became far more rigid once it was visible. Public narratives tend to settle quickly.
Early headlines establish a frame, and repeated coverage reinforces it. Even when new details appear, they are usually absorbed into what's already been accepted, rather than reshaping it entirely. In this case, the first widely shared version of events created boundaries that were difficult to move beyond. By the time statements and visible responses appeared, many of the underlying decisions were already in place. Public-facing actions didn't create direction, they reflected it. What looked like a turning point was often just the moment a private process became observable. This also explains why some responses felt cautious or incomplete. Once a narrative is circulating, direct correction can carry risk. Timing, silence, and careful wording become ways of managing momentum rather than changing course. When Taylor Swift's proximity later became part of public conversation, it entered a landscape where the story had already settled. By that point, awareness didn't equal influence. The conditions that shaped outcomes were no longer flexible, even if discussion around them was still active. Media coverage reinforced this effect. Once certain themes took hold, they were repeated across platforms with small variations. Each repetition made the story feel more finished, even as questions about earlier moments remained unresolved. At this stage, revisiting early context becomes difficult. Access, alignment, and quiet decisions don't translate easily into headlines. They require explanation rather than reaction, and explanation moves more slowly than public attention. This is often the point where stories stop evolving and start being referenced. They become fixed points in conversation rather than ongoing processes. Understanding how this happens helps explain why later disclosures don't always change perception. By the time the public fully engages, the framework has already been set. In hindsight, it's easy to assume the signs were always there. But as this situation was unfolding, very little about it stood out as unusual from the outside. Most of the moments that later appeared significant didn't register that way when they were happening. Early developments blended into everyday activity. Conversations occurred privately. Decisions were made without announcement. Public schedules, appearances, and work continued as usual. Nothing about those early steps suggested a larger shift was underway, or that the situation would eventually draw wider attention. Another reason this wasn't obvious is that public awareness arrived late. By the time most people encountered the story, they were seeing it after several layers had already formed. That made it difficult to distinguish cause from effect. What appeared to be the beginning was often the result of earlier choices that hadn't been visible. Information also surfaced unevenly. Some details appeared quickly, while others remained unclear or incomplete. Without a full picture, people tried to connect fragments in real time. That led to speculation and confusion, rather than understanding of the process that had already taken place. There was also a tendency to interpret events through individual behavior. Actions were often read as emotional or reactive, even when they were shaped by timing and circumstance. Structural factors like access, alignment, and momentum are harder to see, but they tend to be more influential than any single response. This is also why Taylor Swift's involvement didn't seem significant at first. Her proximity existed earlier, but it wasn't visible, and it didn't align with the moments the public was focused on. Without awareness of the timeline, that connection was easy to overlook. Silence added another layer of uncertainty. In the absence of clear explanations, gaps were filled with assumptions. Some expected immediate clarification, while others assumed the lack of comment meant resolution. Neither reflected what was actually happening behind the scenes. It was only later, when more context became available and earlier moments could be placed back in order, that patterns began to emerge. What once looked scattered started to make sense as parts of a larger process, one that had been unfolding quietly long before it became visible. When a case unfolds this way, its impact doesn't end with the last headline or public reaction. The Blake Lively situation continues to matter because of what it reveals about how stories form, settle, and resist revision once they become visible. As time passes, attention often shifts away from reactions and toward process. Questions about how decisions were made, who had access early, and how influence moved before anything became public tend to surface later, not sooner. That's especially true when later information sheds light on earlier moments. This is where Taylor Swift's involvement continues to matter in hindsight, not because of anything said publicly after the fact, but because of how close she was to the situation while decisions were still flexible. Her proximity is relevant to understanding how direction formed, even if it didn't register as significant at the time. Once a narrative takes hold publicly, new details rarely change it outright. They're filtered through what people already believe. Information that might have altered understanding earlier is often treated as context rather than correction when it arrives late. For those involved, this creates limits. Public responses become less about explaining the past and more about managing the present. Choices are shaped by expectations that didn't exist during the early stages, when outcomes were still open. From a broader perspective, this case highlights how early access and timing can quietly shape outcomes. Influence doesn't need to be visible to be effective. Control doesn't need an announcement to shift. By the time a story reaches full public awareness, much of its direction may already be set. This also explains why revisiting timelines matters, not to reassign responsibility, but to understand how momentum builds. When stories are examined only from the moment they become visible, important context is lost. What happens next may not dramatically change how this case is discussed in the short term, but over time, it can reshape how it's understood, not as a sudden fallout, but as a gradual unfolding shaped by timing, access, and early choices made quietly, long before anyone realized there was a story forming. When you step back from the headlines and reactions, the Blake Lively case looks different than it did at first glance. Not simpler and not more dramatic, just clearer. What initially felt like a sudden fallout begins to look more like a process that unfolded quietly over time. The question that runs through all of this isn't about intent or public perception. It's about how stories take shape before they're visible. Who was involved early, who had access when decisions were still flexible, and how those early conditions influenced everything that followed. Seen through that lens, later moments make more sense. Messages didn't suddenly change direction. Public reactions didn't create the outcome. They reflected a path that had already been narrowing long before attention arrived. This is also why Taylor Swift's role matters in context, not because of public statements or visible alignment after the fact, but because of proximity during an earlier phase, when influence didn't need to be announced to be effective. Her presence fits into the story not as a turning point, but as part of the environment in which direction was already forming. None of this reframes what happened publicly. It reframes when it happened, and that distinction matters. When stories are understood only from the moment they surface, important context gets lost. Looking earlier doesn't assign blame, it restores order. Over time, cases like this tend to be remembered in simplified terms. A few moments stand in for a much longer process. But simplification isn't the same as understanding. Understanding comes from placing events back where they belong and recognizing how momentum builds quietly before anyone realizes there's a story at all. That's why revisiting timelines, access, and early influence isn't about reopening debate. It's about clarity, because once you see how this story actually took shape, it stops feeling abrupt and starts to make sense. And in that sense, the most important parts of the Blake Lively case weren't the loudest ones. They were the moments that happened earlier, out of view, when choices were still being made and outcomes were still undecided. If this kind of careful, timeline-first breakdown is useful to you, you'll probably find the rest of this channel helpful as well. Subscribing simply makes sure these longer explanations keep reaching the people who look for them.